The boy should have known something was wrong the moment he glanced back over his shoulder, but he was too tired and wary and afraid to register the truth. He followed the sound of the keening pipe. Its unfamiliar melody, absurdly cheerful, jarred him from the carnage. It filtered through the pores of his skin and infused him with the strength and warmth he needed to run through the icy clutches of winter. The forest muffled the sounds within and beyond, as if the trees themselves swallowed noise, all but the tune of the unseen piper. Time stood still, cradled between the labyrinth of jutting roots and a cotton-cloud sky that was falling apart. Tufts of snow floated down through the naked branches, as if massive pillowcases had exploded during a massive pillow fight between massive gods who did not care that far below them the falling snow sizzled against flames that devoured a village. "Run," his mother had rasped, pushing him through the back door of their home, the door that led to the chickens and pigs, and he'd run until he'd fallen, slipping in the snow and in the refuse of the squealing animals, his vision fractured by his tears. He turned back then, ashamed to have run, ashamed to have left her, even though she no longer quite looked like his mother. Once she had been beautiful, the belle of the village. Then the red blotches appeared, lesions that began on her arms and spread across her chest and throat, an army of ants beneath her skin that disfigured her face and body. She did not cry out when she cut her finger or burnt her hands in the kitchen. Her once lush hair fell from her scalp like shorn wheat, littering the floor in clumps. Yet her eyes were always his mother's eyes, calm and blue and cool like a damp cloth against a fevered brow, radiating such love that he felt she embraced him even when she avoided touching him. She was all he had left, the only person who cared enough to weep and caress his face when lesions spread across his own back and grew thick like the pedicles of a second spine. When he crept back into the house, keeping to the shadows, the boy found nothing left of his mother but a dark stain on the floorboards that streaked from the kitchen to the bedroom. A man appeared in the doorway, his body and face sheathed in fabrics and spells that would not let the infection touch him, gripping a sword that wept red tears from its edge. The boy hid until the man turned away and then sprinted back out into the night. He ran through the streets, dodging the hooves of the horses and torched firewood that the yelling soldiers threw his way. He fell only once when something sharp hit his head. It seemed he opened his eyes mere seconds later. Snow filled his nostrils until he raised his head. Once he did, the scent of smoke engulfed him. The crackle of the fires was nearly drowned by screams that would not end. He scrambled to his feet, the snow beneath him stained crimson as if with wine, and stumbled away from the slaughter towards the trees. And so now he ran, torn by despair and fear, amazed that his matchstick legs could outrun the sinewy limbs of the armored horses and the fiery wrath of their riders' flamethrowers. He wished he could have lifted the axe that had been his father's, with its handle longer than his arm, and swung it into the chest of anyone who dared approach his mother. He wished he had not left her when she pushed him out of their home. He wished he had not seen her blood upon the floor. He wished someone would have come to their village to cure instead of to eradicate. The forest echoed with the shrieks of women who fought and pled and bled as gloved soldiers dragged them through the streets and pushed them into burning homes, of men as their hands, along with the pitchforks of knives they held in them, were severed by the swords whetted on the bones of prior villagers, of children who collapsed when those who chased them flung torches at their backs. And above all this, the haunting croon of a pipe, promising all that a hurt little boy could desire, and so to that piping this little boy fled. The more he ran, the stronger he felt. When he could no longer hear the screams and the flames, the boy realized what the song said. Even though there were no words, it spoke of melted snows and rays of sun that embraced all whom they touched like warm knit sweaters. It spoke of a father who opened his eyes as color filled his cheeks and laughter spilled from his mouth. It spoke of a mother whose skin was smooth and soft and smelled of vanilla and kneaded bread. It spoke of brothers and sisters who danced and teased and loved and lived, who picked him up when he scarred his knees and told him stories when he could not sleep. It spoke of a world where bad things couldn't come, where he could be free to grow old and weathered and well-loved like the most kindly of grandfathers. The boy ran faster, fast enough that it felt like he flew, anxious to get to the world the song spoke of. He even began to catch glimpses of the piper through the trees. Though he scampered and danced as he played his pipe, he appeared sometimes before, sometimes behind, and sometimes beside the boy. He wore a black hooded cloak that hid his face. Beneath it, his clothes were pied, a patchwork of vibrant color, impossible to miss whether the wind whipped back the cloak. His pipe and fingers were white of bone, and just like the boy, he left no footprints in the snow. We lose people all the time. It's just the nature of the job. What can you expect from a place full of nooks and crannies people intentionally go to get lost in? I usually don't worry when I don't see someone for a while, but when it's been days since someone's checked out, it's usually a sign that I need to step in. I'm not doing this alone, thankfully. No librarian ever truly is alone, are they? I have help from the watchers and the listeners of the shelves. Thanks to them, it usually doesn't take long to get the scent, if you know what I mean. However, today is one of the rare and unfortunate exceptions when my search has exceeded more than an hour, and an hour is pushing it. I've been searching and asking around for almost 6 hours, scouring shelves and listening for the telltale breathing. The watchers have their quadrants, so it's much like playing hot and cold. Bad news, one says, and my brain shivers in my skull, both from its existence and its statement. They crossed the tape, says the watcher, and I groan. Are you sure? My stomach still drops at the thought, even though I've been doing this for a very long time. Long enough that I remember every book on every shelf better than my own child's face. But knowing a poor soul lost themselves beyond the tape, I grieve for them. The watcher doesn't speak, but generates an affirmative sensation. That means I have to backtrack to my desk for supplies. I thank them, asking that they send word ahead of my arrival. It's been a while since I've had to go past the tape, which means it's been a while since I entered the broom closet. The helmet is dusty. It looks almost like it's from one of those old-fashioned scuba diving suits. It's not nearly so heavy, though. There's a bright lamp affixed to the front just above the visor, but it's as much of a hindrance as a help, while, most of the time, those beyond the tape know not to bother me. Some still get bored enough to try, and the lamp acts like a beacon. I don't blame them. It's what prisoners do. Find the weakest among them and test their mettle. I've got a sack full of non-perishables, tinctures, aspirin, and a compass, not like the kind you're used to, but would take too long to explain, and time is sort of the essence, so I'll let your imagination handle it from here. I sling the sack across my body and fasten my waist with a utility belt that would make a certain trust fund bat character with abandonment issues a bit jealous. It's got floss, lighters, matches, and a few more tools that don't exist outside of the library. The last thing I grab is the flamethrower. This is where I should be very transparent with you. I'm not actually the librarian. I'm the librarian's assistant. I know. Isn't that just your luck, right? Not to worry. I'm very good at using this thing, and it does the job nicely. Whatever job I may deem necessary at any particular moment, in fact. But the head librarian doesn't really need much of anything to ward off what lingers here. I don't know exactly where he is at the moment, nor do I want to know. If this were a real pickle, I would summon him, but while a rare occasion, it's not unusual in the scope of 1,000 years. After all, no one comes here without the intention, whether it's conscious or subconscious, to get lost. It's the nature of the place. But you know that, don't you? It's why you're here, after all. It doesn't take me long to find the tape, which is fortuitous. Sometimes it moves around, but the watchers and the listeners kept a beat on it this time so as to direct me. Yes, it is really dark. Yes, it's literal tape. Hazard tape. But that's almost like a beacon to the adventurous, isn't it? I think the library knows that. It's greedy, but it's also quite discerning in taste. In some circles, that means that I should extend congratulations to you. In others, I offer my sincerest sympathy. I hear my name and I ignore it as I crawl through the crisscross of reflective stripes. The tape moves not at random, by the way. It genuinely serves as a warning, whether it's gatekeeping sections currently under construction, in repair, or missing. I try not to, but I think that the last one has something to do with where the head librarian went. Don't worry about it. My name is not important. So ineffectual that I've forgotten. I hear my name again as I begrudgingly turn on the lamp. Not a lot of help, just enough light to ensure I don't trip over anything or disturb the shelves. Many sleep here. I send off a warning shot from the flamethrower, showing I carry more light than just atop my appetizing head. The flash of flames sends things slithering, but most of those this close to the tape have never been very convicted by nature, so I'm not concerned. There are more listeners and less watchers past the tape. Well, for obvious reasons. Thankfully, they say I don't have to go too far. I look down at the telling clicking sound to see rocks rolling. Some as big as my foot, and some as small as the tip of my thumb. The smaller ones move more easily, but all are rolling as if pulled toward a central point. I don't even need the compass, but I glance down at it one more time before stuffing it back into my sack. While I don't have to go too far, things are relative here. 10 steps may be 10,000, and so even after only a few moments of exploring, I feel acute pressure jamming into my temples. My heart feels like it's being squeezed and my vision blurs. My fingers tingle by the time I'm able to shake the aspirin into my mouth. I chew it, ignoring the sound of my name, my true name. The one only I can hear. You'll hear your own as well if you stay here long enough. My vision clears, which just means the dark looks sharper, and I sweep another warning arc from the flamethrower for good measure. I do this as much because I love the sound as for the protection. I also appreciate the warmth. It gets cold here, but in a strange way, which shouldn't surprise you at this point. It's cold like how the first signs of spring show in the early morning dew that's only just melted. I can smell and taste the sweat on my upper lip, and it's cold. And then I hear it. A few or 1,000 steps later, the breathing sound I've been listening for. The pace of the rocks quickens and my head turned down so the helmet light prevents me from tripping over or impeding their journey. A famous author once said, "All things serve the beam." And that's as true in this world as it is in others. Except this beam, this beacon, is attached to our lost visitor. I can only hear the rocks mumbling and the breathing sound now. The smell is so musty and thick, like the air is full of sweat and dust, like I've stuck my head out the window during a heavily fallen rain. If I think hard enough about it, soon I'll be drenched. So, I don't. While the rocks are almost a perfect tell, and the listeners too, corroborates the evidence, you can never be too sure. Only light can be sure. I take a match from the tiny box, snap it to life, and then blow it out. Tiny smoke tendrils curl and waft until they also follow the same flow as the rocks. Excellent. We've not been led astray. A few or 1,000 more steps, and the rocks are gathering down an aisle where the breathing is more like wheezing, like the desperate struggle to take it in. Lo and behold, we found them. Poor thing. Judging by the state of her, she got lost early. She's likely been here for most of the day. The book covers her face, consuming her head like a kid on a particularly large popsicle. The pages flutter gently against her too white jaw. The papery quality of her skin and the wanting muscle mass show how little time was on our side. Not a moment to waste. I grabbed the book by the edges of both back and front covers. It's got most of her head inside at this point. Just her earlobes, hair, and edge of her jaw peek out from beneath the pages I now grip firmly. The wheezing turns into a moan that turns into a sob. Now, I say, and test the hold the book has on its victim. It's snug. Too snug to yank like a leech. I need to treat it like a tick, making sure it gets the head out. None of these are intended as puns, but it just happens after being surrounded by books and prose for so long. I draw one of the tiny vials strapped in my utility belt and pull the cork out. It smells like nothing to me, but I see the reaction immediately. Our half-consumed explorer moves a bit, her fingers mostly, and I hear a second, tinier moan beneath that of the books. I pour a small amount of the substance into the palm of my hand, and I smooth it gently down the spine of the book. It wails again, and so does the girl, both full of sorrow and reluctance. I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, so I turn at the hip, cock the flamethrower, and send off a very intentionally long tail of flames. When the feeling subsides, I shrug the weapon back over my shoulder. I use the backs of the two knuckles to knock gently on the book cover. It's time to come back now. My apologies, I say, and I mean it. The book and the girl moan again, more hollowly, and I can feel the seal, the bond, splitting like a seam. I grip the book again because these two are stubborn, and I have to pry them apart. The color and mass return beneath her skin, and though her eyes are open, they can't see anything. She'll be like that for a while. It's normal. She'll recover. I pour the remaining contents of the bottle down the part of her frazzled blonde hair. Tears fill the empty eyes and drip down her face. Her mouth presses into a thin white line and grimaces so intensely that the flesh folds in multiple layers at the corners of her mouth. Great pain. Even after 1,000 years, I still can't help but feel sorry. So I pull her burning head under my chin and rub circles into her back. I'm sorry, dear. I know you've been told otherwise, but this place is a prison, and that isn't your story. Yours is still being written, and the one which made you pretty promises is lying and jealous. One day, you, if the world is cruel, may yet have a place here, but it's not today, so let's go have a cup of tea. I tell her, as I've told many like her. I've gotten better at it over the years. I used to have to fight with them. Often I'd give up and just keep them safe until the head librarian got back to talk them down. She finally lets out a weak, wheezing breath. I take advantage of the broken seam of her lips and pour a tincture down her throat. I don't even have to look anymore. I can just feel the specific melodies that make each tincture different. It helps that the one I need usually sings a bit louder as a courtesy, and it'll purr like a cat when I've touched my fingers to it. She chokes a bit, but her eyes start to clear. Good enough for now. The back of my neck has another sudden influx of goosebumps. We've overstayed our welcome. It's time to go. I put the book back on the shelf. I don't scold it, just allow its ache and frustration to flow through me. I apologize, but there's no comfort I can give. My words and compassion are meaningless. I've noted the volume and will tell the head librarian they might be able to soothe it back to sleep. I tap the metal bauble around my neck and we're back at my desk. I drape the girl onto a nearby love seat that's seen better days, starting the kettle before heading to the broom closet to stash the emergency kit. She'll be fine. People like her, and you, always are. This place was made to help the wanderers and recklessly imaginative, those who can't wrap their heads around the world the way it is, and can see the truth of magic between heartbeats and heartbreaks. And people like me, and the head librarian, when they so choose to grace us with their presence, keep the peace orderly and open for you. And we're here to help guide you back on track if you lose inspiration for your own story. It's the nature of the job, the library itself. What else can you expect from a place full of nooks and crannies that people choose to get lost in? The world slowed the moment the car hit me. I didn't hear the screech of the tires or the sickening thud of my body against the hood. Instead, there was silence, an unnatural void. Time unraveled, stretching thin as I hit the pavement. My bones cracked like brittle twigs and blood pooled in my mouth, but my thoughts were somewhere distant, disjointed. I opened my eyes to find myself lying on the playground across the street. The world felt wrong. The edges of my vision blurred and everything dim and colorless. A deep, throbbing ache spread through me, but the pain was distant, like it belonged to someone else. I sat up, and the familiar setting of the playground twisted in my mind. I hadn't been here in years. Why was I here now? The sky hung low and oppressive, an endless void of gray. The swings stood motionless, the rusted slide loomed like a grave marker, and the merry-go-round sagged under the weight of decay, its faded colors giving it a sick, diseased appearance. I looked at my hands, blood-stained, but not enough. Shouldn't there be more? Shouldn't I feel more? A cold dread began to creep in. My phone, I thought. I should call for help. But when I reached into my pocket, it wasn't there. Of course, it wasn't. I looked across the street to where the accident had happened, but the intersection had dissolved into a dense, rolling fog, thick and heavy, like it had swallowed the world whole. Panic twisted in my chest, its claws sinking deep. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled, barely able to support me. My vision blurred again, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. The air felt wrong, too thick, too cold. Something dark slithered in the back of my mind, something I couldn't shake. Then I heard it. Laughter. It cut through the silence like a razor, high-pitched and sweet, but it sent a chill racing down my spine. Slowly, I turned. On the swing set, barely brushing the ground with her feet, sat a little girl in a red dress. Her hair dark, brown, hung in two neat braids, and she swayed gently, her laughter soft and melodic. But it wasn't just any girl. It was me. Me at 8 years old. I felt my stomach lurch, acid rising in my throat. This wasn't possible. The dress, the shoes, the way she sat. It was all too familiar, too real. My heart pounded in my chest, a cold sweat breaking across my skin. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were locked on her. She smiled at me, an eerie, knowing grin that sent waves of nausea through me.
"Come play,"
she said, her voice light and innocent. But there was something beneath it, something dark, something twisted. I stumbled back, my limbs shaking uncontrollably. This couldn't be happening. The fog had crept closer, surrounding the playground like a living, breathing thing, thick and suffocating. My breath hitched as I realized there was no way out, nowhere to run.
"Come play with me. Come on,"
she whispered, her voice carrying through the fog. I turned, wanting to escape, but when I looked back, she was standing right in front of me. Too close, far too close. Her eyes were wrong, dark, hollow, as if something else was staring out from behind them. And her smile, it stretched too wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that no child should ever have.
"I've been waiting for you,"
she hissed, her voice low and sinister.
"You promised you'd come back."
I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my throat tight, every instinct screaming at me to run, to move, but I couldn't. I was frozen, paralyzed by her gaze. The little girl giggled, the sound grating and unnatural, her face contorting with amusement.
"Oh, you know. You remember. You said you'd come back and stay
My pulse quickened, fear clawing at the edges of my sanity.
I never. Yes, you did.
She interrupted, stepping even closer. I could feel the cold radiating off her, seeping into my bones.
And now you're here, just like you promised.
Time blurred after that. I ran, or tried to, but every time I reached the edge of the playground, the fog pushed me back, like some twisted, invisible force was playing with me. It felt like an eternity, wandering in circles, desperate to escape, only to end up back at the swings, back to her. She never left, always there, always waiting. The nights were worse. When I collapsed from exhaustion, sleep brought no peace. My dreams twisted into nightmares, repeating the accident over and over. But in some dreams, I wasn't hit by a car. I walked into it, willingly, my body moving without my control, like a puppet on strings. In others, I stood in the playground watching the car barrel towards me, but feeling no pain, only a heavy, crushing sense of inevitability. The fog never lifted. The little girl never disappeared. Days, weeks, I couldn't tell anymore. Time slipped away, each moment bleeding into the next. My body began to change. I looked gaunt, my skin pale and stretched tight over my bones. My reflection in the broken mirror of the slide was unrecognizable, some ghostly version of myself. The girl, on the other hand, seemed to grow, taller, sharper, darker. She was no longer the child I remembered, but something else, something wrong.
Why are you doing this to me?
I whispered one night, my voice hoarse and broken from days of screaming. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable, but her eyes gleamed with something like pity.
You did this to yourself,
She murmured.
You wanted to escape. You didn't want to grow up. Don't you remember?
Her words struck deep, bringing with them a flood of memories I'd long buried. The fear of growing older and crushing weight of expectations. The endless anxiety that gnawed at me every day. Hadn't I wished for this? Hadn't I wanted to escape it all? I couldn't deny it anymore. This was my punishment, my price for wanting to go back, for refusing to face the world. The playground had claimed me, and now it would never let go. Now, I sit on the swing next to her. The fog presses in on all sides, but it no longer suffocates me. The little girl is no longer separate from me. We are one and the same. And I swing, back and forth, back and forth, in this endless, gray world. I was always meant to stay here. I do not choose to take lives, but I carry their silence within me. I have become the blade that knows no mercy. Instead, I know the dance of blood and the whispers of death, which fade into a deafening silence, a warm noise as blood flows into a chasm of time, the knife of silence. That is what he called me, the one who listens to me every night, who cleanses me of the thoughts of the world and plunges me deeper into the despair of the macabre. I was born in flames and struck by the hammer, my steel carrying within it an implacable destiny. I was supposed to be a mere object, a tool meant to bring order to the chaos of daily life, and each night that passed, I lay on a shelf in a forgotten store, a relic of a bygone time, where light barely pierced through, as if the sun refused to touch that old, tired building. Once, the store had white walls, but the imprint of time covered them with a thick layer of mold and dust. And the ceiling, cracked and stained, seemed ready to collapse at any moment. The shelves had become the prey of termites, often empty and sorrowful, creaking at every touch of the air. A flickering bulb barely held off the darkness, swaying gently in an invisible breeze. The smell was that of forgotten things, of wet wood and years of neglect. Everything felt as though time itself had retreated from that place, leaving it in a state of slow, painful decay. I was a prisoner, just like the other objects, abandoning any hope of escape. The shopkeeper was merely a shadow of a man, old and bowed under the weight of his years, always behind the counter, on a creaky chair with a gaze lost somewhere far away in a vanished world. He emanated the loneliness of the place, and his soul was weighed down by the burden of the years that had passed. His face was etched with deep wrinkles, and his eyes were dim, covered by a veil of exhaustion and resignation. It seemed as if he had forgotten how to speak, for he rarely uttered a word, and those who entered the store often looked at him with either pity or disgust. His gnarled, trembling hands moved slowly, endlessly rearranging the same useless objects day after day, a ritual that never ended, creating a comforting routine. For both him and me, a knife like any other, lying on a forgotten shelf. When he looked at me, it seemed as though he saw me as just another object, yet in his quiet, sad way, I believe he understood me. We were both prisoners of that forgotten place, condemned to fade away without leaving any trace. In that store, time did not pass. There were no dreams, no hopes, only a pressing despair and endless wait. But one moonless night, everything changed. Heavy footsteps pierced the oppressive silence of the store, interrupting the rhythm of its dead eternity. His silent entrance became a storm, tearing through the stifling air. I felt my blade tremble lightly, anticipating something I could not yet understand. His empty gaze found me immediately, as if he knew I was there, waiting to be chosen. I knew he was different from the others who came and went, people who ignored the suffocating silence of the place, rushing after the illusions of life. He moved slowly, with cold determination, an invisible attraction that I felt like a deepening tension. He reached out, and his cold, long fingers gripped my handle with a terrifying familiarity. He freed me from the cage of the dusty shelf, and as he lifted me, a shiver ran through my blade. Not fear, but a shiver of home and anticipation. I was no longer a mere object, a victim of a numbed existence. I had become alive, ready to plunge into the fatal dance of fate. His gaze, reflected in the mirror of my soul, was devoid of emotion, with a darkness that seemed to swallow everything. He had a face that looked as though it had been pulled from the darkest nightmares, marked by deep shadows. We left into the cold night, he with his heavy steps, and I, silent and motionless, yet more alive than ever. I could have said I'd known my destiny in that instant, but his life thread had already been knotted by Lachesis, and our fates were intertwined in a macabre weave. The journey to his home felt like a descent into a nightmare, a slow fall into a world where time and space seemed suspended. The night air was dense, oppressive, soaked with whispers that he spoke like a creed, a prayer to the ghost of the past. The streets were abandoned, weighed down by the exhaustion of a world that no longer cared if it trampled over its own end. Each shadow cast by pale lanterns distorted on the pavement, following us. The wind shook the dried leaves on the trees and brought them into our path, hissing through the corners of old buildings, which seemed to sigh in the night's silence. The sense of unease grew stronger, and the building gradually shed the beauty of the sun, their windows covered only by dust and cobwebs, watching us with hollow eyes like mute witnesses. From time to time, the distant barking of a stray dog could be heard, but the sound quickly faded, swallowed by the vast silence surrounding us. The abandoned factory glared at us with disdain from its dead shell. His house was nothing but a reflection of his soul, a ruin, a place where nothing remained, only broken memories and deafening silence that urged any soul toward oblivion. In front of his house lay a darkness that snuffed out any trace of life. Cerberus, a lion, with hollow eyes and a stone mane shredded by rust, stood as a guardian of the underworld, foretelling that anyone who entered there would not leave alive. The door creaked open with a strong, sinister sound, like a groan from the bowels of the earth. He did not stop. He kept walking until he reached an almost empty room. A table in the corner and a half-burnt candle. That was all. I sensed his agitation, though not nervousness, and I felt him gently place me on the table. I had become a sacred object. Laughing, he sat on the floor and pulled a chest from beneath the table, from which he took out his trophies. A ring stained with rust, an old brooch, a shawl torn and stained with deep marks of despair and blood. He arranged them before me on the table, with obsessive precision, as if presenting them to an old friend. He remembered every name, every face, every voice. Suddenly, his obsessive laughter turned into screams at the memories that haunted him.
Real? They're not real. Or maybe they are.
Doubt consumed his mind, and I, his trusted blade, was always close by. Sometimes he grasped my handle, but his touch would suddenly become a caress.
Try again. Set yourself free.
I was seen as the final solution when he lifted me and clenched me, and I could feel the thrill of anticipation. I realized that every murder he committed was just a desperate attempt to sever any ties with those voices, to lock them away in Tartarus forever. But he would always leave me back on the table.
They know. They see. They're coming for you.
His screams seemed to strike the walls, scratched with various words, each more confusing than the last.
We are one. We all die at some point.
Were the most common. The voices echoed like distorted reverberations, feeding his paranoia. I saw him caught between fantasy and reality, from which he began to detach more and more.
Why don't they disappear? Why are they still here?
He looked at me with despair and moments of lucidity, when he remembered that he had once been an ordinary man, when the voices did not follow him at every step, when he wasn't a prisoner of his own mind. He remembered fragments, a window open to a warm room, the faces of loved ones, his wife in the floral robe, his child babbling, filling his heart with happiness, friends who shared laughter and stories from the past. These were rare moments of clarity when he recalled what it was like to be whole, without the chaos in his mind. He remembered how the sun used to stream through the window and warmth would envelop him, bringing a peace he now desperately sought. But suddenly, his world would crumble, the faces full of joy would become stained with blood, and the voices would start gnawing at him, word by word. Before me, crouched on the floor, he whispered, like a prayer to a god who had abandoned him. The cold shadows of the past became more aggressive, and I could hear them more and more clearly. The rusty ring belonged to his wife, whom one of the voices had taken from him with the promise of release. That night, he believed that if he ended her suffering, all the madness would cease.
You saw her, didn't you? How the blood trickled down her angelic face, how her voice faded away. But the others continued.
That night, he fell prey to the worst illusion, that he would find peace. But instead of silence, the voices multiplied, reality and fantasy intertwined, and I, a knife, was the silent witness to his agony. He lifted me from the table and gripped me with a fury born from despair. The voices grew stronger, and another face took shape in his eyes, another ghost from the past, another victim who wore the old, time-scorched brooch. She had become familiar to him, and he began to weep and beg for forgiveness. But the voice of the face began to scream and curse him. and from its eyes flowed streams of bloody tears.
You will never escape. We are part of you. We are all you have left.
The image seemed to swell before him, filling the entire room with its presence.
There is no forgiveness for you.
He trembled, crushed by memories and the weight of his deeds. Clutching me tighter, he knew that I was his only remaining solution. Suddenly, the woman's face vanished, but in the other corner of the room, it transformed into a crib which came the wailing of a child, a cry of desperation that had never had the chance to turn into words. The search for his mother had found no path to life but death, deafened by voices. Another knife had found its way into his heart. The sound became wrenching, like the lament of a life wasted in time. His gaze, fixed on me, turned towards that shadow of the past.
My child, please. Please forgive me. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to lose you.
The blood-stained shawl was, in fact, a swaddling cloth for the one who was supposed to be his child. The objects were not trophies, but his link to reality, a harsh reminder of the voices, which had been reduced to mystifying silence. But in that crib, the voices grew louder, soaked with a mix of fury and despair, and the grip in which he held me became suffocating, the desire to end it all turning into a clear goal. He sought release desperately, and I became the object of his tragic ending. Before my blade unfolded, an absurd theater in which the agony of his crimes was unstoppable, where he was a mere secondary character. The dance of reality and illusion grew more and more frantic, for his mind was caught in a whirlwind of memory and hallucinations. The chorus of the underworld pushed him towards the edge of the abyss. Suddenly, everything became quiet. The voices abruptly fell silent, and the whole world seemed to slow down. I could no longer find a trace of his crimes, agony, or the despair of the voices in his mind. It was just him, with a lost gaze. Before him, the air took the form of a beautiful woman, a young girl dressed in a black gown, with skin white as milk, and black hair that seemed to foretell the end. She took the hand in which he held me and guided me towards his chest, battered by the burden of a life born from chaos. The tip of my blade pierced his skin, and she, Atropos, pushed me gently. The final moment felt like the prelude to his release. The woman with the face of death looked at him with a cold tenderness, a caress that promised peace, not punishment.
You know what you have to do. At last, you will be free.
I saw him as he sought peace, and I was the magical object that paved his way into the void. I felt his body gradually give way as I wrapped myself in his warm blood. Each beat of his heart became an embrace and turned into a distant echo, like a final breath. His eyes looked at me, and with a sad smile, his face turned towards the woman who brought him peace.
Forgiveness. Forgiveness.
He whispered those words not only for those he had lost, but for himself, for the mistakes that had marked his existence. In that moment, in that final look, I felt how his pain and despair transformed him into the deep peace he had sought for so long. The silence was now complete, without the voices that tormented him, without the ghosts of the past that gnawed at his mind. I, the knife of silence, had been the quiet witness to his fall. And along with his last breath, I felt that he had been freed from the cycle of suffering. In that silent room, everything became still. For me, the burden of carrying the peace of those who had been freed remains. I do not take lives, but I carry their silence within me, and now I carry his as well. My cold gleam, clothed in blood, is the silent witness to his end. This is the burden I will always carry within me until someone else finds me and takes me from a forgotten shelf, and I will dance again in the light of shadows. For him, it was all over. But for me, the dance continues, wrapped in that silence, carrying the peace that only death can bring.